The easiest lie to believe is the one told by the person wearing the badge. The conference room inside the Brookhaven Police Department had never been quieter. Aaliyah Carter stood beside the long wooden table with her hands restrained in front of her, her navy blazer slightly wrinkled after what had been described as a routine vehicle inspection only minutes earlier. She did not lower her eyes. She did not argue. She simply watched the room with a calm expression that seemed strangely out of place for someone facing such serious accusations. Officer Grant Holloway stood across from her with the confidence of a man who had spent more than 20 years believing his word would always carry more weight than anyone else's. Resting on the table between them was a sealed evidence package, a completed incident report, and a leather credential wallet displaying the gold letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Around the room, several officers remained silent while Captain Richard Dalton folded his arms, waiting for Holloway to explain exactly how an ordinary training exercise had turned into a federal embarrassment. Holloway cleared his throat and tapped the report with one finger. The evidence was recovered during a lawful inspection of her assigned vehicle, he said in a steady voice. Witnesses were present. Documentation has been completed. Chain of custody has already been established. His words filled the room with practiced certainty. No one interrupted him. A few officers exchanged uncertain glances, but years of habit kept their questions locked behind polite silence. Imagine standing there knowing everyone has already decided which story sounds more believable before you have spoken a single sentence. Imagine realizing that sometimes the loudest voice in the room is not the strongest one, only the most familiar. Holloway slid the report across the table toward Aaliyah. Read it carefully, he said. If you believe anything is inaccurate, now is your opportunity to say so. Aaliyah looked down at every page with remarkable patience. She read each line from beginning to end before quietly placing the report back on the table. Then she looked directly at Holloway. Is this the final version you intend to submit into the system? She asked. Holloway frowned slightly, surprised that she had not denied the accusation or challenged the evidence. It is, he answered without hesitation. Every statement is accurate. Aaliyah gave a slow nod. Thank you, she replied. Her response puzzled everyone in the room. Captain Dalton leaned forward. Miss Carter, he said carefully. Before we continue, I need your Federal Bureau of Investigation credentials. Aaliyah reached inside her blazer. Her fingers briefly touched a small silver pin fastened near the edge of her collar before she removed her credential wallet. She held it in her hand, but did not immediately pass it across the table. Instead, she asked one final question. Officer Holloway, are you certain there is nothing you would like to correct before this becomes part of the permanent record? Holloway almost smiled. There is nothing to correct. The confidence in his voice echoed across the room. Then his department-issued phone vibrated against the polished wood. Every head turned toward the screen as a notification appeared in bold letters. Secure Federal Record Archived. The color drained from Holloway's face as he stared at the message, unable to understand why a routine report had triggered a secure federal notification. Aaliyah remained perfectly still. She neither smiled nor celebrated. Sometimes the truth arrives without raising its voice. Sometimes it waits until the last signature has been written before revealing who has really been documenting the story. 72 hours earlier, when Aaliyah Carter first walked through the front doors of the Brookhaven Police Department, carrying nothing more than a notebook and the title of Federal Bureau of Investigation Trainee, nobody inside that building realized they were about to become part of an investigation already quietly underway. 72 hours earlier, the Brookhaven Police Department looked exactly the way people expected a trusted police station to look. Patrol cars lined the parking lot in neat rows, the American flag moved gently above the front entrance, and officers walked through the lobby carrying coffee cups and morning briefings as another ordinary day began. Nothing about the building suggested that hidden beneath its routine was a pattern that had remained unnoticed for years. At precisely 8 o'clock, Aaliyah Carter stepped through the front doors carrying a simple messenger bag, a notebook, and temporary identification identifying her as a Federal Bureau of Investigation trainee assigned to complete a field observation program. She greeted the receptionist with a polite smile, signed the visitor log, and quietly thanked the dispatcher who directed her toward the morning briefing room. She did not introduce herself with authority. She did not expect special treatment. She behaved exactly as everyone expected a trainee to behave. Officer Grant Holloway noticed her almost immediately. Standing beside the coffee station, he watched her shake hands with Captain Richard Dalton before taking a seat near the back of the room. His expression remained pleasant, but the judgment behind his eyes appeared almost instantly. To Holloway, she was young, inexperienced, and someone who would need constant supervision. He never bothered asking about her background. Instead, he simply assumed he already understood it. When the briefing ended, he walked over with an easy smile that sounded friendlier than it felt. "You are here to learn," he said. "Around here that starts with listening more than talking." Aaliyah nodded respectfully. "That is exactly why I am here, officer." Holloway looked briefly surprised that she answered without the slightest trace of frustration. "Good," he replied. "Then you can begin by helping with file organization instead of field operations." Several nearby officers exchanged quick glances, but said nothing. Imagine entering a room where someone has already decided what you are capable of before hearing your first complete sentence. Sometimes prejudice does not announce itself loudly. Sometimes it hides behind polite instructions, lowered expectations, and opportunities quietly withheld. Throughout the morning, Holloway assigned Aaliyah every administrative task he could find. She sorted archive paperwork, updated inventory labels, delivered interoffice files, and organized training materials while other officers attended investigative meetings. Whenever she politely asked whether she could observe an interview or evidence review, Holloway answered with the same patient smile. "There will be time for that later," he said more than once. "Learn the basics first." Aaliyah never argued. She thanked him for every assignment and carefully completed each one without complaint. By lunchtime, she had memorized the layout of nearly every hallway, recognized which officers greeted one another with genuine respect, and noticed that conversations often stopped whenever Holloway entered the room. She also realized something else. The routine jobs she had been given placed her surprisingly close to records, evidence logs, and storage areas that experienced investigators rarely visited anymore. While reorganizing outdated filing cabinets, she quietly observed how evidence requests were processed, who approved them, and which signatures appeared repeatedly across old case files. Holloway believed he was keeping her away from important work. In reality, he had unknowingly guided her toward exactly the information she needed. As the afternoon came to an end, Aaliyah closed her notebook after recording one final observation. She looked through the glass window toward the evidence room just as Holloway unlocked the heavy door after normal access hours. He glanced down the hallway, stepped inside alone, and gently closed the door behind him. Aaliyah checked the time on the wall clock, wrote it carefully onto the last line of her notes, and quietly walked away without looking back. The following morning arrived with the same calm rhythm as the day before, but Aaliyah Carter had already begun seeing details that most people overlooked. The Brookhaven Police Department depended on routine. Reports were filed in familiar order, evidence moved through predictable channels, and officers trusted that every number printed on an official label represented an unquestionable fact. Trust, she had learned during her training, was one of the strongest foundations of any institution, but it could also become its greatest blind spot. Shortly after 9 o'clock, Captain Richard Dalton asked Aaliyah to help reconcile several archived evidence records that were being transferred into a digital database. The assignment sounded ordinary enough that no one paid much attention when she carried 3 aging case folders into a small records office beside the evidence room. Dust covered the edges of the folders, and each one represented a case that had been closed years earlier. She carefully compared handwritten logs with electronic entries, moving one page at a time without rushing. Most files matched perfectly, exactly as they should. Then she stopped. One evidence package identification number appeared in front of her, and moments later she saw the exact same number inside another unrelated case. At first she assumed it was nothing more than a clerical mistake. She checked a third file. The same identification number appeared again. Aaliyah slowly leaned back in her chair. 3 completely different investigations carried one identical evidence seal. That was not simply unusual. It should have been impossible. Every evidence package was required to receive its own unique tracking number from the moment it entered police custody until the day the case officially closed. She opened the digital inventory system and searched the number again. The database listed only one active record, while the archived paper files clearly documented 3 separate investigations. One belonged to Marcus Hill, a black mechanic who had insisted years earlier that evidence had been planted to justify his arrest. Another file had been marked administratively destroyed after the appeal period expired. The third package was still listed as physically stored inside the Brookhaven evidence room. Aaliyah did not react outwardly. Instead, she copied the case numbers into her notebook exactly as they appeared and quietly continued working as though nothing had happened. Imagine discovering that 3 separate stories all depended on the same impossible detail, while everyone around you continued treating it as another ordinary morning. Sometimes the smallest number on a forgotten label carries more truth than 100 official reports. Before leaving the records office, she reviewed the electronic access history connected to the active evidence package. The system showed routine inspections over several years, but one name appeared more frequently than anyone else's. Officer Grant Holloway had accessed the package multiple times, including one entry only a few weeks earlier. The reason field simply stated inventory verification. That explanation sounded reasonable until she compared it with department policy. Inventory verification required 2 authorized employees whenever sealed evidence was removed for inspection. The electronic log listed only Holloway. No second signature appeared anywhere. She closed the screen before anyone noticed how long she had been studying it. As she returned the folders, Officer Caleb Morgan walked past carrying patrol equipment and casually mentioned that very few people ever requested archived evidence unless a court ordered a review. His comment seemed harmless, yet it quietly confirmed that Holloway's repeated access had never been considered routine by everyone inside the department. Aaliyah thanked him, placed the folders back onto the storage shelf, and looked once more toward the heavy evidence room door. She no longer believed she was looking at isolated mistakes. She was beginning to see the outline of a pattern, and somewhere behind that pattern stood someone who had grown comfortable believing nobody would ever connect the pieces together. By the beginning of the 3rd day, Brookhaven Police Department continued moving through its familiar routines, but Officer Grant Holloway had started noticing something that did not fit. Aaliyah Carter never seemed to ask unnecessary questions, yet she always appeared to be exactly where old records, forgotten storage logs, or overlooked paperwork happened to surface. She never interrupted meetings, never challenged senior officers, and never acted like someone searching for misconduct. Instead, she listened carefully, thanked everyone for their time, and quietly wrote notes that nobody considered important. Holloway had built his career by trusting his instincts, and his instincts were beginning to tell him that the young trainee was paying attention in ways that ordinary trainees never did. Late that afternoon, he walked past her temporary desk and casually glanced toward the small notebook resting beside her computer. Aaliyah noticed him before he spoke, but continued organizing paperwork without changing her expression. "Keeping busy?" Holloway asked with a polite smile. "Yes, sir," Aaliyah answered. "Captain Dalton asked me to organize several administrative records before the end of the week." Holloway nodded, his eyes lingering on the notebook for only a second before he continued down the hallway. The exchange lasted less than half a minute, yet Aaliyah understood exactly what had happened. He had not been interested in the paperwork. He had been measuring her reaction. Imagine realizing that the person you are quietly observing has also begun observing you. The investigation had entered a different stage. It was no longer just about finding answers. It had become a contest of patience. Before leaving for the evening, Aaliyah made one small adjustment. She opened her notebook and filled several pages with harmless observations that led nowhere. She listed maintenance schedules, outdated file references, and incorrect case numbers that had no connection to the evidence room or Marcus Hill. She even circled a storage cabinet that had been emptied months earlier. Anyone reading those pages would believe she was following an entirely different trail. The real notes remained somewhere else, safely separated from anything that could be discovered by chance. The following morning, she returned to her desk and immediately noticed that one corner of the notebook had shifted slightly. It was only about half an inch from where she had left it, barely enough for anyone else to notice. A faint crease appeared on a page she distinctly remembered closing flat the previous afternoon. She quietly opened the notebook and confirmed that nothing had been removed. Whoever had looked inside wanted information without leaving obvious evidence behind. Aaliyah closed the notebook exactly as she had found it and calmly continued her work. Across the room, Holloway watched from his office window before turning away with quiet satisfaction. He believed he had learned something useful. Instead, he had followed a path she had deliberately placed in front of him. Later that day, while delivering updated inventory forms near the evidence room, Aaliyah accessed the electronic entry log for only a few moments. She compared after-hours access records against duty schedules and found another inconsistency. Holloway had entered the evidence room several times when no second authorized employee had been recorded, even though department policy required dual verification. Each visit appeared ordinary by itself, but together they formed a pattern that became increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence. She copied the dates into memory rather than onto paper, closed the system, and walked away before attracting attention. Holloway believed he had successfully redirected her investigation. In reality, every step he took to protect himself quietly revealed another piece of the truth, and without realizing it, he was beginning to leave a trail that would soon become impossible to explain. The deeper Aaliyah Carter looked into Brookhaven Police Department, the more she realized that missing evidence was only part of the story. Records could be altered, reports could be rewritten, and inventory logs could be manipulated, but people carried memories that were far more difficult to erase. Late that afternoon, after finishing another routine assignment, she drove across town to a modest auto repair shop where Marcus Hill now worked rebuilding damaged pickup trucks. The smell of motor oil mixed with fresh paint drifted through the open garage as Marcus looked up from an engine compartment, wiping his hands with a clean towel before walking over. He recognized the identification clipped to her jacket and hesitated for a moment before offering a cautious handshake. "I thought nobody from law enforcement wanted to hear from me anymore," he said quietly. Aaliyah met his eyes without interrupting. "I am here to listen," she answered. "Only if you are willing to talk." Marcus nodded slowly and led her toward a small office behind the garage. He described how years earlier he had insisted that evidence discovered during a traffic stop had never belonged to him. Every complaint he submitted had been dismissed because the official reports all matched one another. Every appeal ended with someone pointing to paperwork that appeared complete. After a while, Marcus said, staring out the dusty window, "People stop asking whether the paperwork is true. They only ask whether it exists." Aaliyah thanked him for his honesty, but made no promises she could not keep. Before leaving, she quietly asked one final question. "Who completed the final report?" Marcus answered without hesitation, "Officer Grant Holloway." That evening, Aaliyah visited Lorraine Davis, whose adult son had also been connected to one of the archive case files she had reviewed. Lorraine welcomed her into a small brick home where framed family photographs covered nearly every wall. She spoke calmly, yet every sentence carried years of disappointment rather than anger. She explained that she had written letters, attended public meetings, and requested reviews of the investigation involving her son, but every response assured her that department procedures had been properly followed. "Nobody ever wanted to hear about what happened before the report," she said softly. "They only wanted to read what was written after." As Aaliyah left the neighborhood, one thought continued repeating in her mind. Different families, different years, different circumstances. Yet every path somehow returned to the same officer and the same official paperwork. The following morning, while returning several evidence transfer forms, she crossed paths with Officer Caleb Morgan near the patrol lockers. He hesitated before speaking, making certain no one else stood close enough to hear. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly. Aaliyah nodded. Caleb lowered his voice even further. "Have you been looking into old evidence cases?" She did not answer directly. "Why do you ask?" Caleb looked down the hallway before continuing. "Because there was one patrol car camera recording that never matched the report I read. I copied it years ago, before it disappeared from the system. I never showed anyone because I believed nobody would believe me." He paused, taking a slow breath. "If you are really trying to understand what happened here, then you should know Officer Holloway was not the only person who benefited when people stopped asking questions." Aaliyah thanked him but never reached for the recording. Not yet. Trust was something earned one careful conversation at a time. As she walked back through the station doors, she realized the investigation had quietly shifted. She was no longer collecting isolated facts. She was uncovering a pattern sustained by silence, protected by routine, and strengthened each time someone decided it was safer to look away than to ask one more difficult question. The next morning began with unusual urgency, moving through the halls of Brookhaven Police Department. Conversations became shorter, office doors closed more often, and Officer Grant Holloway spent far more time checking his department phone than speaking with other officers. Aaliyah Carter noticed every change without drawing attention to herself. She continued organizing records, answering routine questions, and carrying folders from one office to another with the same quiet professionalism she had shown since her first day. Nothing about her behavior suggested she had uncovered anything significant. That was exactly the impression she wanted everyone to keep. During a brief conversation near the records office, Aaliyah casually mentioned to another administrative employee that federal inventory records would soon be compared against local evidence logs as part of a standard training exercise. She spoke softly, never raising her voice, and never once mentioned Officer Holloway by name. The comment sounded harmless, almost forgettable, but police departments had always relied on conversation moving faster than official memorandums. Within an hour, Holloway had heard the same information from someone else. He stopped what he was doing and quietly asked when the review was expected to begin. The answer reached him exactly as Aaliyah had expected. "Tomorrow afternoon," another officer replied. "Apparently, they want everything synchronized before the weekend." Holloway forced a calm smile, but the thought remained with him for the rest of the day. Imagine believing that years of carefully protected records might suddenly receive attention from people outside your own department. Even an innocent announcement can become frightening when someone knows there are questions waiting beneath the surface. Shortly before the end of his shift, Holloway returned to the evidence room carrying a routine inspection clipboard. He signed himself into the electronic access log, unlocked the heavy steel door, and disappeared inside. From a nearby hallway, Aaliyah noticed the entry appear in the access system exactly as she expected. Once again, no second authorized employee accompanied him, despite department policy requiring dual verification whenever sealed evidence was handled. She did not approach the room. She simply recorded the time in her memory and continued walking toward another office. Holloway remained inside longer than usual before finally leaving with an expression that looked composed on the outside but increasingly restless beneath the surface. The following morning, he watched Aaliyah more closely than ever. Every time she spoke with another employee, his eyes briefly followed her. Every time she carried a folder, he seemed to wonder what information might be inside. Yet she never changed her routine. She smiled politely, thanked co-workers for their assistance, and continued behaving like an eager trainee completing ordinary assignments. The more ordinary she appeared, the more uncertain Holloway became. By late afternoon, uncertainty had begun turning into calculation. If federal reviewers questioned old evidence records, then the credibility of the person asking those questions would matter just as much as the records themselves. Holloway leaned back inside his office, staring through the glass toward the parking lot where Aaliyah's assigned vehicle sat beneath the fading sunlight. Slowly, an idea began taking shape in his mind. If the trainee became the subject of an investigation instead of the observer conducting one, every note she had collected could be dismissed as an attempt to protect herself. Every inconsistency she discovered could be portrayed as a distraction. Every concern she raised could lose its credibility before anyone seriously examined it. Across the building, Aaliyah quietly closed her notebook and slipped it into her bag. She had seen the growing tension in Holloway's face, the repeated trips to the evidence room, and the careful way he watched her every movement. She understood that people who believed they were running out of time often made decisions they would never have considered while feeling secure. She left the station that evening without looking back, fully aware that the most dangerous moment in any investigation often arrived just before the truth finally revealed itself. The following afternoon unfolded exactly the way Officer Grant Holloway had planned, or so he believed. The Brookhaven Police Department operated with its usual rhythm as patrol officers returned from calls, dispatch radios echoed through the hallways, and administrative staff completed stacks of paperwork before the end of the shift. Nothing about the station suggested that the next hour would become the moment everyone remembered for years afterward. Aaliyah Carter spent most of the afternoon updating inventory records and answering routine questions from the records office. She never hurried. she never appeared distracted. Anyone watching her would have seen nothing more than a quiet Federal Bureau of Investigation trainee completing another ordinary assignment. Holloway watched from across the hallway with growing confidence. In his mind, the uncertainty of the previous day had disappeared. He had convinced himself that the only way to protect his reputation was to destroy hers before anyone outside the department had a reason to believe what she might report. Shortly before 4 o'clock, Holloway approached Captain Richard Dalton and calmly suggested conducting a routine inspection of the government vehicle assigned to Aaliyah. He explained that federal trainees were expected to follow the same accountability standards as every officer in the department and that documenting the inspection would eliminate any appearance of favoritism. Captain Dalton hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. Several officers accompanied them into the parking lot as witnesses, believing they were about to observe nothing more than another standard departmental procedure. Imagine standing in a crowded parking lot while everyone around you assumes the outcome has already been decided. Sometimes the greatest pressure does not come from accusations themselves. It comes from the quiet expectation that no one will question the person making them. Holloway unlocked the vehicle and began his inspection with deliberate precision. He opened storage compartments, checked beneath the seats, and carefully described each step for the benefit of everyone watching. His confidence seemed almost rehearsed. Finally, he reached beneath the rear seat and paused. Slowly, he lifted a sealed evidence package into view. A murmur spread through the small group as every eye followed the package in his hands. Holloway turned toward Captain Dalton with controlled satisfaction. "This was recovered from the assigned vehicle," he announced. "The chain of custody has clearly been compromised." Several officers looked toward Aaliyah, expecting surprise, denial, or anger. Instead, she remained perfectly still. She neither stepped forward nor attempted to explain herself. Her expression never changed. Holloway interpreted her silence as defeat. "Miss Carter," he said firmly, "I am requesting your Federal Bureau of Investigation credentials pending notification of your supervising office." Aaliyah looked directly at him before quietly reaching inside her blazer. She removed her credential wallet but kept it in her hand instead of immediately surrendering it. Then she asked a single question in a calm voice that carried across the parking lot. "Officer Holloway, are you certain you have completed every step exactly the way you intended?" Holloway answered without hesitation. "Absolutely." She nodded once. "Thank you." Those two words sounded strangely out of place, almost as though she had been waiting to hear that answer. Captain Dalton instructed everyone to move into the conference room so the incident could be formally documented. Holloway carried the evidence package himself, while several officers followed behind in complete silence. As they walked through the hallway, he believed every witness had just watched his version of events unfold exactly as planned. What he could not see was that every statement he had made, every decision he had taken, and every document he was preparing to sign had quietly become another piece of a much larger record, one that had been growing long before anyone gathered around that vehicle, and one that was now only moments away from revealing who had truly been under investigation all along. The conference room door closed with a quiet click that seemed louder than any voice inside the building. Officer Grant Holloway placed the sealed evidence package in the center of the table as though presenting the final piece of an undeniable case. Captain Richard Dalton remained standing near the window while several officers lined the walls in complete silence. Aaliyah Carter calmly rested her Federal Bureau of Investigation credential wallet on the table without sliding it toward anyone. She looked at the completed incident report one final time before lifting her eyes toward Holloway. "Officer Holloway," she said evenly, "I want to make certain there will be no revisions after today." Holloway answered with complete confidence. "Everything I documented is accurate." He signed the final page with a firm stroke of his pen and pushed the paperwork toward Captain Dalton. A moment later, his department phone vibrated across the polished tabletop. He glanced down with mild irritation, expecting another routine message, but the notification displayed only 4 words that instantly changed his expression. "Secure Federal Record Archived." Before anyone could ask what the alert meant, another knock echoed through the conference room. The door opened, and Special Agent Laura Bennett entered alongside 2 federal investigators dressed in plain business attire. Their identification remained visible, and their calm expressions carried the unmistakable confidence of people arriving exactly when they intended. Laura looked first at Aaliyah before turning toward Captain Dalton. "Thank you for keeping everyone together," she said. "This timing is helpful." Holloway frowned. "Helpful for what?" Laura calmly placed a sealed folder beside the incident report. "For completing a federal public integrity investigation that began before Miss Carter arrived at this department." The room became perfectly still. Imagine believing you have just exposed someone else, only to discover you have been standing inside someone else's investigation from the very beginning. Sometimes the truth does not arrive with raised voices. Sometimes it simply walks through the door carrying documents that have already answered every question. Holloway attempted a polite laugh. "There must be some misunderstanding." Laura slowly shook her head. "There is no misunderstanding. Miss Carter was assigned here as part of an authorized investigative operation after repeated concerns regarding evidence handling and report integrity." Holloway looked toward Aaliyah, searching for some sign of triumph, but her expression remained unchanged. Laura continued, "The evidence package recovered from her assigned vehicle contains a microscopic federal tracking identifier that was documented before this operation began. It was never intended to leave secured storage without authorized observation." She opened the folder and revealed printed access records. "Electronic logs show that you entered the evidence room repeatedly outside normal procedures. Department policy required 2 authorized employees during those inspections. The records show only your credentials." Holloway immediately responded that he had merely completed inventory checks, but Laura quietly placed another document on the table. "Your written report states that you discovered this package during a routine inspection. Unfortunately, building access records, vehicle location data, and secured monitoring records establish a different sequence of events." She then looked toward Aaliyah's collar. "Would you please remove the pin?" Aaliyah gently unclipped the small silver pin from her blazer and placed it beside the paperwork. Laura nodded. That authorized recording device documented every significant interaction during today's inspection, including statements made before the package was presented. Holloway stared silently at the objects spread across the table as each separate detail he had considered harmless became another link connected to the next. The evidence identification numbers, the after-hours access logs, the inconsistent inventory records, the testimony waiting from former cases, Caleb Morgan's preserved patrol recording, and now his own signed report all pointed toward the same conclusion without requiring anyone to raise their voice. No one celebrated. No one argued. The room simply grew quieter as everyone realized that the person many had underestimated had never needed to overpower anyone. She had only needed patience, accurate records, and the willingness to let every documented fact speak for itself. Several weeks later, the atmosphere inside the Brookhaven Police Department felt noticeably different. Familiar hallways remained busy, patrol cars still came and went throughout the day, and officers continued answering calls from the community. But one important change could not be ignored. People had started asking questions that had once been left unspoken. Internal reviews expanded beyond a single incident as independent investigators reopened evidence files connected to Officer Grant Holloway's reports. Cases that had remained closed for years were examined with fresh attention, not because assumptions had changed, but because the records were finally being compared against facts that had always been there waiting to be noticed. Marcus Hill received a formal notice that his case would be reviewed by an independent panel. When he read the letter, he sat quietly inside the same repair shop where he had once accepted that no one would ever listen. Across town, Lorraine Davis received a similar update regarding her son's case. She held the envelope in both hands for several moments before opening it, not because she expected instant answers, but because someone had finally acknowledged that her questions deserved to be heard. Sometimes justice does not begin with a courtroom or a headline. Sometimes it begins with a single decision to reopen a file that everyone else believed should remain closed forever. Officer Caleb Morgan also made a decision that changed more than his own future. After years of carrying uncertainty, he voluntarily provided the preserved patrol vehicle recording he had quietly protected. The recording did not stand alone. It matched electronic access logs, evidence records, witness statements, and documentation gathered throughout the investigation. Each independent piece confirmed another until the larger picture became impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Captain Richard Dalton likewise faced administrative review regarding repeated failures to recognize warning signs that had accumulated over several years. The investigation concluded that accountability belonged not only to those who acted improperly, but also to those who repeatedly overlooked opportunities to ask necessary questions. Responsibility, everyone learned, could spread through silence just as easily as through action. Aaliyah Carter never stood before cameras and never sought recognition for her role. On her final afternoon in Brookhaven, she quietly packed the same messenger bag she had carried through the front entrance only days earlier. Her notebook contained careful observations, documented timelines, and completed assignments, but it also contained reminders that every investigation depended upon patience rather than pride. Before leaving, she walked through the nearly empty records room one final time. The shelves looked unchanged, yet she understood that every corrected file represented a family receiving another chance to be heard. Special Agent Laura Bennett met her outside beneath the American flag waving above the entrance. She handed Aaliyah her completed evaluation and smiled with quiet approval. "You completed your assignment exactly as intended," she said. Aaliyah accepted the folder but looked back toward the building instead of celebrating. "The assignment is complete," she answered softly. "The work is not." Laura nodded because she understood exactly what those words meant. Institutions earn trust one honest decision at a time, and preserving that trust required people willing to protect the truth even when doing so required extraordinary patience. As Aaliyah drove away, the evening sun reflected across the station windows, reminding everyone who remained inside that authority alone could never guarantee integrity. Only accountability could do that. Officer Grant Holloway had believed a badge would always make his version of events unquestionable. In the end, it was not power that decided the outcome. It was every quiet fact he underestimated, every record he believed no one would examine, and every person he assumed would never be heard. The strongest voice in the room had never been the loudest one. It had always been the truth, patiently waiting for its turn to speak.